Okay, so let's continue our discussion of Norman Bowker's character. So in speaking of courage, we have his character struggling in the aftermath of the war, and there's this feeling like he wants to communicate with others, he wants to tell his story, but he feels stuck and doesn't quite have the words or senses that there's not a willingness to listen to his story. And the nature of the story itself is very sort of horrifying, and it is something that he feels guilty about because he thought he could have acted more courageously, and this is what causes him a lot of suffering and heartache, feeling like he could have done something differently, or if only he had been more courageous or more brave in that moment, he maybe could have saved Kiowa's life. But we know that he, is in a situation, a life or death situation, and it's, definitely understandable that he acted in the way that he did. And there's, very little that could have been done differently, but this feeling of guilt can be viewed as an example of survivor's guilt, which is another aspect of post-traumatic stress disorder. So if we look more closely at a definition of survivor's guilt, we can see it as a feature of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it refers to phenomenon wherein those who survive a traumatic event that had many people fatalities begin to experience strong feelings of guilt for having lived through the event. At extreme levels, survivor guilt may result in self-condemnation or self-punishment, as well as severe depression. So there is this feeling like if you survived a horrifying event where many people lost their lives, it's kind of this guilt where you feel, you don't know why you survived and another person died, and you think you could have done something differently, or maybe acted in that moment and saved their lives. So there's all these feelings of regret and guilt, and obviously it ends up being very destructive in the lives of the survivors who cannot sort of move on with their lives, and are continually sort of reminded or haunted by memories of this past event. And we see this with Norman Bowker, who sort of punishes himself for Kiowa's death, and the full extent of this, his feelings are realized in the second part of the story, in the section called Notes, when we learn that in 1975, Norman Bowker, or Speaking of Courage, was published, and then 3 years later, Norman Bowker hung himself in the locker room of the YMCA in his hometown. So he actually commits suicide following Tim O'Brien's sort of publishing of the story, and we could sort of see there is a connection between his survival of this horrifying event and then the inability to speak about it, feeling stuck and haunted, and not being able to move on. So it is a tragedy that touches not only Kiowa's life, whose life is lost during that moment, but it also has effects for those individuals who witnessed this horrifying death of their close friend, and especially for Norman Bowker, who felt he could have, done more or done something differently and saved his life. So he sees it as, a failure on his part, a failure of courage, and it ends up he takes his own life because of this. So he's definitely an example of the post-stress disorder in a Vietnam veteran, and we see him struggling with this guilt and depression. So I just want to briefly talk about the circumstance of Kiowa's death. Tim O'Brien will talk about, he'll actually talk about how he rewrote the story over and over again until he sort of captured the reality, or as close as he could to the truth of that incident. And the truth is that Kiowa sinks into this mud, which is literally human shit, right? It is the waste of the human waste of this town. So the mud is sort of saturated with urine and feces, and this is the stink that sticks with Norman Bowker long after the events and prevents him from acting more courageously in the moment. So there is a kind of metaphoric or symbolic element in the fact that they're dealing, or they died in human waste, and here we have human lives being wasted at the same time, right? So there's kind of this poetic justice or poetic moment where we have human lives being wasted, all of the potential of these young men being ruined in the war, and then literally Kiowa and to some extent Norman Bowker lives being ruined, wasted in shit, right? So it is a very sort of strong image, and one of the lasting sort of you'll think about that scene over and over again long after this book is over, because you can't imagine a worse way to die, right? Like drowning in human shit. So we have an incident where Norman Bowker cannot sort of forget this moment, and there is an interesting sort of second part to this story where we have Norman Bowker writing to Tim O'Brien and asking him to write his story. So we have the voice of Norman Bowker appearing again in the section called Notes, where he writes and asks Tim to tell his story because he doesn't have the words to tell it himself, and he feels sort of silenced and unable to communicate it, and stuck within his own mind. So he asks Tim to write about it and speak truthfully and honestly about that day. And then Tim O'Brien sort of he has had the opposite experience of Norman Bowker in the sense that he is continually telling his story over and over again by writing about the war. And Norman Bowker is sort of caught in silence, and he can't express himself, or he has no outlet, whereas Tim O'Brien continually has an outlet for his stories. So in this way, we do see the importance of storytelling, of having a voice, of sharing one's stories in connection with the healing of psychological trauma. And even Freud discovered this connection. If you think about the nature of psychotherapy, it's also called the talking cure, right? So in a therapy session, all you do pretty much is just talk about your life and events that have, stuck with you, or traumatic moments in your past. So that's all therapy is, where you are sort of talking about yourself and what happened to you. So talking telling one's truth, telling one's stories. This is healing, and it can be healing and helpful for those who have experienced something traumatic. And in a way, Tim O'Brien helps himself. So he changes his own life, heals through his writing. So we have that as well. And in a way, he helps Norman Bowker's story be told, even though Norman Bowker takes his own life. He still sort of keeps his friend's story alive by writing about it. And it's almost the gift that Norman gives to Tim is this ability to actually represent what is sort of authentic or true, the pain and suffering of that real situation. So in the first original version, Tim O'Brien sort of omits some of the harsh or gritty details. So on page 180, he says, I was forced to omit the shit field and the rain and the death of Kiowa, replacing this material with events that better fit the book's narrative. But he felt at that point, that he didn't do justice to the story. And then following Norman Bowker's suggestion, he will rewrite this piece. So he didn't tell the truth, and then after Norman Bowker hanged himself, Tim O'Brien rewrote the story. He wrote the story speaking of courage, and in a way it's a tribute to his friend Norman Bowker, who also died that day in a symbolic way when Kiowa fell drowned in the mud. And then on 182 we have Tim O'Brien reflecting on this experience. So he says, it was hard stuff to write. Kiowa, after all, had been a close friend, and for years I've avoided thinking about his death and my own complicity in it. Even here it's not easy. In the interest of truth, however, I want to make it clear that Norman Bowker was in no way responsible for what happened to Kiowa. Norman did not experience failure of nerve that night. He did not freeze up or lose the Silver Star for valor. That part of the story is my own. So interesting sort of twist or insight there at the end where he does say, maybe the real Norman Bowker, not this fictionalized version, actually did win the Silver Star and did not freeze up that night. But we do know the real Norman Bowker also committed suicide. So there is this lingering sort of uncertainty. We don't quite know the sort of truth or fictional aspects of what really happened that night. So we do know that the traumatic event, Kiowa's death, was something that stayed with not just Norman Bowker but with Tim O'Brien, and has continually haunted these men long after that event has ended. Okay, so we're going to move on and talk a little bit more about Tim O'Brien and his self-reflective writing. So any other comments about Norman Bowker, you could also make note of how Tim O'Brien is sort of in contrast with Norman Bowker in the sense that he is able to write and express his thoughts where Norman Bowker feels very sort of silenced and has to sort of, he internalizes his feelings and feels guilty and inverts all that anger and sadness within himself and feels sort of stuck that way. Okay.